Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You'll figure it out, my mom said with a shrug, her voice so casual, so unconcerned, as if I had just asked for advice on what to make for dinner instead of begging for help in the worst moment of my life. My father sat across from me, arms crossed, his mouth pressed into a thin, unimpressed line, giving the occasional nod to whatever she said, as if they had already discussed this beforehand. As if this was just another routine rejection they had rehearsed in private before I even walked through the door. I sat at their kitchen table, my hands gripping the cheap ceramic mug my mother had placed in front of me, my fingers curling around it for warmth, though no amount of heat could thaw the cold, sinking feeling that had settled deep in my stomach. I had known, on some level, that this would happen, had felt it in the way they never truly offered anything without strings attached, had seen it in the way they spoke about people who relied too much on family, but some foolish, desperate part of me had clung to the idea that surely they wouldn't do this to their own daughter. I had worked hard my entire life, never once asked them for anything beyond what any kid expects from their parents: love, support, maybe the occasional word of encouragement when things got tough, but I had never been the one to lean on them financially. Had never needed to. But when the company I had been working for suddenly downsized, when I found myself without a paycheck, without a safety net, without a clue as to how I was going to keep a roof over my head, I had swallowed my pride, convinced myself that this was exactly what family was for, and driven across town with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, hoping that maybe, just this once, they would be there for me. They weren't. "It's not like you're homeless," my dad finally said, his voice carrying that same detached, vaguely annoyed tone he always used when he thought I was being dramatic, as if I was exaggerating the severity of my own situation. "You'll figure it out. You always do." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes flicking toward the clock on the wall, a clear signal that he was already tired of this conversation, already waiting for me to leave so he could go back to watching the evening news without interruption. "We've got our own bills to pay, Rachel. We can't just be handing out money every time something doesn't go your way." I stared at them, my mind racing to process the words, to wrap my head around the sheer indifference in their voices, the way they had shut me down without even pretending to consider what this meant for me. I wasn't asking for a handout, wasn't asking them to fix my life for me. I just needed something, some temporary relief, some assurance that I wasn't completely alone in this, but they were making it clear that I was. I swallowed hard, pressing my lips together to keep the sharp words from spilling out, the kind that I knew would only make things worse, the kind that would turn this conversation into another lecture about how they raised me to be independent, how they had never asked their own parents for anything, how they had done just fine without any help. I forced a slow breath through my nose, staring down at the half-empty coffee cup in front of me, feeling the heat of humiliation crawl up my spine as I realized I had been foolish enough to believe they would be different, that they would care. "So that's it?" I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended, but firm enough that they both looked at me, just for a moment, before my mother sighed and got up to rinse her mug in the sink. "I lose my job, I struggle to pay rent, I try to get back on my feet, and you're telling me that you can't help, or you just won't." My mother dried her hands on a dish towel, not even bothering to turn around as she replied, "Rachel, you're an adult. This is just part of life. You'll figure it out." The words echoed in my head, bouncing around like they were slamming against every nerve in my body, settling into my bones, searing themselves into my memory in a way I knew I would never be able to forget. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the tiled floor as I stood, my body moving on autopilot, my heart hammering in my chest, my vision tunneling in a way that only happened when I felt a kind of anger so deep, so consuming, that it threatened to choke the air out of my lungs. I grabbed my coat, pulled it on with stiff, jerky movements, barely registering the words they were still saying, the half-hearted, patronizing reassurances that things would work out and that everyone goes through rough patches. I didn't respond, didn't look at them, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing just how much their words had sliced through me. I forced a tight, bitter smile as I reached the front door, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles turned white, my breath steady, controlled, my mind already racing with a new thought, a new promise, a new plan. One day, I would figure it out. And when I did, they would regret ever turning me away. The first few weeks after losing my job felt like a free fall into an abyss that had no bottom, a slow, suffocating descent into uncertainty where every single day was a battle against panic, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of knowing that no one was coming to save me. I woke up every morning with a dull ache in my chest, the kind of heaviness that made it hard to breathe, hard to move, hard to do anything but stare at my phone screen. Refreshing job postings and sending out applications with the kind of desperation I had never felt before in my life. My savings, once a small but comforting safety net, dwindled faster than I had expected, disappearing beneath rent payments, utility bills, and the basic necessities I hadn't even thought to budget for when I had assumed I would always have a steady paycheck. I cut back on everything I could, slashing every unnecessary expense from my life with a kind of ruthless efficiency that I hadn't known I was capable of, forcing myself to live on instant ramen and dollar store groceries, rationing gas in my car like every mile could be the one that finally left me stranded. I swallowed my pride and took whatever work I could find, picking up shifts as a temp, walking dogs for people who could afford to pamper their pets in ways I couldn't even afford to treat myself, delivering food to doorsteps in neighborhoods where the houses were so big they looked like they had been plucked straight from a movie. Some days, I worked 3 jobs back to back, waking up before the sun rose and crawling into bed long after midnight, my body aching, my mind running on nothing but sheer willpower and caffeine that I could barely justify buying. Humiliation became a daily companion, a shadow that followed me into every interaction, every forced smile, every moment where I had to bite my tongue and pretend I wasn't dying inside when someone from my past recognized me delivering their takeout order or working a shift at a front desk, their awkward attempts at small talk only making the knot in my stomach tighten further. But no matter how hard it got, no matter how many nights I cried from exhaustion, no matter how tempting it was to pick up the phone and call my parents to beg for even the smallest bit of relief, I refused to give them the satisfaction of knowing how much I was struggling. Instead, I kept going, pushing forward with a kind of stubbornness that bordered on self-destruction, telling myself that if I could just survive this, if I could just hold on a little longer, anything had to give. And then, one day, it finally did. It happened by accident, a chance encounter that felt like a cruel joke at first, a reminder of everything I had lost, but somehow, against all odds, turned out to be the thing that changed everything. I had just finished a delivery, my hair pulled back in a messy bun, my uniform wrinkled from hours of running around in the heat, when I heard someone call my name, their voice hesitant, uncertain, as if they weren't sure I would even remember them. I turned around, my heart sinking as I came face to face with Lauren, a woman I hadn't seen in years, someone I had once worked with before our lives had taken separate paths, before everything had fallen apart for me in ways I never could have anticipated. For a split second, I considered pretending I didn't recognize her, making some excuse, walking away before she could say anything that would make me feel even worse about where I was in life. But before I could do anything, she was already smiling, already reaching out, already asking how I had been. I forced myself to smile back, to push down the shame curling in my chest, to nod and say I was doing fine, even though we both knew that was a lie. But instead of the awkward pity I had been expecting, instead of the forced condolences or the condescending offers of help, she just looked at me for a long moment, her expression thoughtful, before she asked a question I hadn't been prepared for. "Are you looking for something full-time?" The words hit me like a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs before I could even process them, my brain scrambling to keep up as I blinked at her, trying to figure out if I had somehow misheard. She went on to explain that the company she worked for was hiring, that they needed someone reliable, someone hardworking, someone who wasn't afraid to grind to get things done, and before I could talk myself out of it, before the voice in my head could remind me that good things didn't happen to people like me anymore, I said yes. The next few weeks passed in a blur, a whirlwind of interviews, paperwork, and cautious hope, the kind I hadn't allowed myself to feel in what felt like a lifetime. And then, just like that, I had a steady paycheck again, a real job with benefits, something that felt like stability, something that felt like the first step toward reclaiming everything I had lost. It wasn't glamorous, wasn't the dream career I had once imagined for myself, but it was enough, more than enough, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. Slowly but surely, I started paying off debts, started rebuilding my savings, started setting my sights on something I had never even dared to consider before: buying a house. The idea had seemed laughable only months ago, a fantasy so far out of reach that I hadn't even let myself dream about it. But now, with every paycheck, with every carefully budgeted expense, with every late night spent scrolling through real estate listings, it started to feel possible. And then, one day, it wasn't just possible, it was real. I sat in the office of the real estate agent, my hands trembling as I signed the final documents, my name scrawled across the pages that made it official, that solidified the fact that this house, this space, this accomplishment was mine. Something no one had handed to me, something no one could take away. I felt the weight of everything I had been through crash over me in waves: the exhaustion, the frustration, the loneliness, the sheer fury that had fueled me in the darkest moments. And as I looked up and met my agent's eyes, I smiled, a real, genuine smile, for the first time in what felt like forever. I had done it. I had figured it out. And no one, not my parents, not the people who had doubted me, not even the past version of myself who had once thought this was impossible, could ever take that away from me. I had barely been living in my new house for a month when my parents showed up unannounced, standing on my front porch like they had every right to be there, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach their eyes, their expressions a carefully crafted blend of pride, excitement, and something I couldn't quite name but already suspected wasn't genuine. I hadn't seen them since the day they turned me away, since they told me to figure it out without a second thought, since I had walked out of their house carrying nothing but the weight of their rejection and the promise I had made to myself that they would regret it one day. And now, standing there in the soft glow of my porch light, shifting their weight awkwardly as if they weren't sure how to begin the conversation, they looked different, older, wearier, almost hesitant in a way I had never seen before. I should have shut the door in their faces, should have told them that they had made their choice and I had made mine, should have reminded them that I had needed them once and they had shrugged, had dismissed my desperation like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. But instead, I forced a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach my own eyes either, and stepped aside, letting them in with a politeness that I knew would throw them off balance, a quiet, calculated move that let them believe, for now, that they still had a chance at controlling the narrative. The moment they stepped inside, my mother's gaze swept over the house, her eyes flicking from the high ceilings to the carefully decorated living room, the brand new furniture that I had picked out myself, the framed photos on the walls that told a story of a life they had not been a part of. My father let out a low whistle, nodding approvingly as he glanced around, stuffing his hands into his pockets like he was casually appraising the space, like he was trying to decide if it met whatever unspoken standards he had convinced himself were important. Well, he said finally, rocking back on his heels, his voice carrying the faintest trace of something I almost mistook for pride before realizing it was something else entirely. You really figured it out, didn't you? The words made my stomach tighten, my fingers curling slightly against my palm, my nails pressing into my skin as I fought the urge to laugh at the sheer audacity of it all. He said it like it was some offhand remark, like it wasn't the exact phrase he had used when he refused to help me, like he wasn't repeating the very same words that had sent me spiraling into months of desperation, exhaustion, and sheer survival mode. I smiled, my expression smooth, practiced, revealing nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I guess I did, I said lightly, watching as my mother nodded along, her lips pursed in what I could only assume was pretend approval, her eyes still scanning the room as if she was searching for something, an opening, a weakness, a way in. We sat down in the living room, the atmosphere shifting into something that felt almost like a forced family reunion, the kind where everyone knew there were things left unsaid but pretended not to notice, filling the space with meaningless small talk and overly enthusiastic compliments that didn't quite feel sincere. My mother gushed about how impressive the house was, how grown-up everything looked, how proud they were that I had managed to pull myself up after such a difficult time. My father nodded along, chiming in occasionally, throwing in a casual good for you, kiddo, or hard work really does pay off, his tone carefully measured, deliberately supportive, as if they had always believed in me, as if they had always been on my side. And then, just as I had been waiting for, just as I knew would happen, my mother sighed, her smile faltering just slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of her coffee mug in a way that told me the real reason they were here was about to make an appearance. "We've actually been having a bit of a rough time ourselves lately," she said, her voice soft, hesitant, laced with just enough concern to make it seem natural, as if the thought had only just now occurred to her. "You know how things are, the economy, the bills. It's been hard keeping up with everything." She offered me a small, almost sheepish smile, the kind meant to tug at heartstrings, to inspire guilt, to make me feel obligated to care. "And, well, we were wondering if maybe you could help us out. Just a little loan. Nothing too big, just enough to get things back on track." I could feel my heart pounding, not with anxiety, not with guilt, but with something dangerously close to satisfaction, the kind that came from watching a long-anticipated moment unfold exactly as I had predicted. I had known this was coming, had expected it the second I signed the papers for this house, had understood deep in my gut that my success, the very thing they had once dismissed as impossible, would be the thing that brought them crawling back. I kept my face neutral, nodding slowly as if I was genuinely considering the request, as if I hadn't already seen this play coming from miles away, as if I didn't already know exactly how this conversation was going to end. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice light, friendly, helpful. "I'd love to help. But, I'd need to take a look at some things first, just to make sure I understand what's going on. Maybe go over your finances together, see where the problem is, figure out the best way to help you get back on track." I watched as my mother's smile stiffened, as my father's posture tensed just slightly, as a flicker of something uneasy passed between them in a way that most people wouldn't have caught, but I did. They hadn't expected me to ask questions, hadn't thought for a second that I would do anything other than nod along and hand over the money, hadn't considered the possibility that I would dig deeper. "Of course," my mother said after a beat, forcing out a small chuckle, waving a dismissive hand as if to brush away any concerns. That's a good idea. We can go over everything together." I smiled again, slow and easy, the kind of smile that didn't give away the fact that I already knew exactly what I was going to find. Because I had a feeling their struggles weren't as innocent as they wanted me to believe. The moment my parents left my house that night, I wasted no time getting to work, my mind already piecing together the puzzle I knew would reveal the real reason they had come to me, the truth buried beneath their carefully chosen words, their hesitant smiles, their desperate attempts at pretending this was just bad luck. I had learned a long time ago that my parents didn't struggle in the way normal people did, that their definition of hard times wasn't the same as what I had lived through, that when they said they needed help, it rarely meant they were actually suffering. It just meant that they had run out of ways to sustain whatever lifestyle they had convinced themselves they were entitled to. I started with what I already knew, pulling up public records, scanning financial documents, sifting through anything that might give me insight into exactly what had gone wrong. It didn't take long before the truth began to reveal itself, a slow, unraveling thread of reckless spending, bad decisions, and a level of entitlement so absurd that I had to sit back and laugh at the sheer irony of it all. My parents had been living well beyond their means for years, spending money like it would never run out, taking vacations they couldn't afford, upgrading cars every 2 years, dining out at expensive restaurants while convincing themselves they deserved to enjoy the finer things in life. And yet, despite their comfortable income, despite the fact that they had always prided themselves on being responsible adults, they had managed to rack up tens of thousands of dollars in debt, all under the assumption that if things ever got too tight, if the bills ever became too much, they could always fall back on me. That was the part that made my stomach turn. The realization that this wasn't just about poor financial decisions or bad luck or an unexpected crisis. This was intentional, a safety net they had built without my knowledge. A backup plan where I was expected to swoop in and save them without hesitation, without question, without considering for even a second whether they had ever done the same for me. I sat at my desk, my fingers tapping idly against the surface, my mind racing through every possible way I could handle this, every scenario that played out in my head, every possible reaction I could have. I could tell them no, could shut them down immediately, could throw their own words back in their faces and walk away without a second thought, but something about that felt too simple, too easy, too merciful for people who had made me suffer, who had watched me struggle to survive and shrugged as if it wasn't their concern. No, I wasn't just going to refuse them. I was going to teach them a lesson they would never forget. When I invited them over the next day, they arrived looking hopeful, expectant, almost relieved, as if they had convinced themselves that everything was already taken care of, that I was going to be the good daughter and do exactly what they wanted. My mother was already smiling before she even stepped inside, the kind of saccharine expression that made my skin crawl, the one she always used when she wanted something, the one that had fooled me for years before I finally learned what it meant. My father was quieter, more reserved, his jaw set, his hands tucked into his pockets, his usual attempt at pretending he wasn't uncomfortable when things weren't entirely going his way. I led them to the dining room table, where I had everything neatly laid out, a collection of documents, printed statements, and every single financial mistake they had made over the last 5 years spread across the polished wood surface like a crime scene. I watched as my mother's smile faltered, as my father's posture stiffened, as the realization of what they were looking at slowly, painfully, deliberately sank in. I took my time, walking them through every unnecessary expense, every reckless choice, every luxury purchase they had made while I had been barely scraping by, every moment of indulgence they had enjoyed while telling me to figure it out on my own. I laid it all out in painstaking detail, not raising my voice, not letting a single hint of emotion slip through, keeping my tone cold, detached, matter-of-fact, just as they had been when they turned me away. By the time I finished, the room was silent, the weight of everything I had just revealed hanging in the air like a noose tightening around their throats. My mother looked as though she had been slapped, her face pale, her hands clasped together in her lap as if she were trying to keep herself from shaking. My father had gone completely still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a spot on the table, unwilling to meet my gaze, unwilling to acknowledge the truth staring him in the face. So, I said finally, leaning back in my chair, tilting my head slightly as I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "You want it alone?" My mother swallowed hard, forcing a tight, uneasy smile, her voice carefully measured in a way that made my stomach twist with something dangerously close to satisfaction. Yes, just something small," she said, her tone softer now, hesitant, like she was testing the waters, waiting to see if I was going to make this easy for them. "We'd, of course, pay you back, sweetheart. It's just temporary." I exhaled slowly, nodding as if I was considering it, as if I was truly, genuinely debating whether I would give them exactly what they wanted. And then, finally, I smiled, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that made people nervous, the kind that let them know they had already lost before the game had even begun. "Of course," I said smoothly, reaching into the folder beside me and pulling out a legally binding loan contract, complete with high interest rates, strict repayment terms, and clauses that ensured they would never be able to escape the debt they had willingly walked into. "But you'll have to sign this first." I watched as my father's face turned red, as my mother's hands trembled when she picked up the contract, her eyes scanning the pages, her lips parting slightly as she began to process exactly what I had done. They had expected an easy way out, had assumed I would step in without question, had believed that I would fix their mess just as they had assumed I would always be there to clean up after them. But now, staring at the cold, unforgiving terms of the deal I had just handed them, they finally understood the truth. This wasn't a gift. This was a lesson. And whether they signed it or not, they had already lost. The silence that followed my offer was the kind that stretched so thick it could choke a person, the kind that filled the space between us with the weight of everything left unsaid, the kind that held more power than any words ever could. My mother sat rigid in her chair, her hands gripping the edges of the loan contract so tightly that her knuckles had turned bone white, her lips pressed together in a tight, bloodless line as she scanned the terms, flipping through each page as if she might somehow find a loophole that would save them from what was coming. My father had barely moved, his eyes fixed on the document in front of him, his jaw locked so tight that I could see the muscles twitch beneath his skin, his pride warring with the cold, hard reality that he had no way out of this that didn't end with him on his knees. I let them sit in their discomfort, let them stew in the consequences of their own actions, let them feel, for the first time in their lives, what it was like to be desperate, to be trapped, to realize that no one was coming to bail them out. I thought about all the nights I had spent lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was going to afford rent, how I was going to buy groceries, how I was going to pull myself out of the pit they'd watched me fall into without so much as lifting a finger. I thought about the nights I had driven home from one job just to shower and change before heading to another, the way exhaustion had settled into my bones, the way I had swallowed my pride over and over again just to survive. And now, watching them squirm, watching them realize that I was no longer their safety net, that I was no longer the child they could manipulate into doing whatever they wanted, I felt nothing but satisfaction. "So," I said finally, my voice light, casual, as if we were discussing something as mundane as what to have for dinner. "Are you going to sign it or not?" My mother exhaled sharply through her nose, shaking her head as she let the papers drop onto the table, her hands trembling as she reached up to rub at her temples, her frustration barely contained beneath the surface of her forced composure. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her voice strained, as if the words physically pained her. "Rachel, we're your parents. You really expect us to agree to something like this? With these terms?" I tilted my head slightly, watching as my father finally looked up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burning with something dangerously close to humiliation. "You were expecting something easier?" I asked, letting my lips curl into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Something with no strings attached? Maybe a check you wouldn't have to pay back at all?" My mother's jaw clenched, her nails digging into the fabric of her slacks as she forced out a breath, her gaze flicking toward my father as if waiting for him to say something, to fix this, to somehow regain control of a situation that had long since slipped through their fingers. But my father remained silent, his hands curling into fists against the table, his pride bleeding out in real time as he realized exactly how powerless he was in this moment. "I seem to remember asking you for help once," I continued, leaning back in my chair, crossing my arms as I let my gaze drift between the two of them, watching as they flinched at the reminder. "And I believe your exact words were 'you'll figure it out.' So that's exactly what I did. And now, it's your turn." My mother let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking her head as she reached for her purse, already deciding that if they couldn't win this game, they weren't going to play at all. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, standing up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I should have known you'd hold this over our heads." I shrugged, unfazed by her dramatics, by the way her voice wavered just slightly as she tried to regain some semblance of dignity. "You should have known I wouldn't forget," I corrected, my voice calm, even merciless. My father stood without another word, his face set like stone, his silence speaking louder than anything he could have said. He wouldn't sign. I had known that before I even handed them the contract. His pride wouldn't allow it, even if it meant losing everything, even if it meant walking away with nothing but the weight of his own failure sitting heavy on his shoulders. My mother hesitated, looking at me as if she wanted to say something else, as if she was searching for the right combination of words that would undo everything, that would make me change my mind, that would somehow turn back the clock to a time when I was still desperate for their approval. But there was nothing left to say. Without another word, they turned and walked toward the door, their footsteps heavy, their shoulders tense, the weight of their downfall pressing down on them like a burden they had never expected to carry. I followed behind them, slow, steady, In control, my pulse steady, my heart unburdened, my conscience clear. As they stepped outside, my mother turned one last time, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, but before she could, I reached into the small cabinet by the door and pulled out one last envelope, pressing it into her hands before she could refuse. She looked down at it, her brows furrowing, her fingers tightening around the edges, before she finally opened it, her breath hitching as her eyes scanned the contents. It was a bill. An itemized breakdown of every dollar I had ever spent trying to keep myself afloat while they watched from the sidelines. Rent payments, grocery bills, loan interest, late fees. Every single expense I had incurred during the time they had turned me away, every moment I had struggled while they had been comfortable, every dollar they had refused to give when I was at my lowest. Her face drained of color, her lips trembling as she looked up at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel, this is fair," I said simply, watching as the realization hit, as the weight of everything I had just done settled deep into her bones. "This is exactly what you taught me." She didn't respond, couldn't respond, because for the first time in her life, she had no argument, no excuse, no justification that could erase what she had done. I stepped back, gripping the door handle, offering her one final, cold, unforgiving smile. "I expect full payment within 6 months," I said, echoing the very words she had once used to dismiss me. "Or, I'm sure you'll figure it out." And then, before she could say another word, before my father could so much as lift his gaze, I shut the door in their faces, locking it behind me, closing the chapter on them for good. As I turned away, as I walked back into the home I had built for myself, as I exhaled the last remnants of whatever obligation I had once felt toward them, I let my mind wander for just a moment, let the questions settle somewhere deep inside me. Let the weight of it linger, even as my victory tasted sweet on my tongue. Was it worth it? I let out a slow breath, let my fingers trail along the walls of my house, let the silence settle around me like a long-awaited comfort. Maybe, but at what cost?